Hello, rogues, witches, and everyone in between. I've been playing a lot of Path of Exile 2 lately, and I've been thinking about it a fair bit. I want to just quickly take a moment to talk about some disorganized thoughts I had. Don't expect any structure to this video, it's literally just a bunch of rambling. I just had these thoughts, I wanted to get them out before I got back to playing the game. I recently started a hardcore solo self-found character. He's the same class as my first character, so a monk. I started a monk, and my hardcore character is also a monk. I just found it really interesting because I've never played hardcore in an ARPG before. I've never actually played that many ARPGs before to begin with. But I'm really enjoying Path of Exile 2, and I wanted to just get my thoughts on this just out there as a relatively new player, inexperienced player who just doesn't really know all that much. So I think this way to play the game is really interesting. It's a fresh way to play that not many will engage with, but it adds genuine tension and stakes to the experience to an unmatched degree. So solo self-found means that there can be no community involvement. It basically means you cannot party with anyone and you cannot trade with anyone. So everything you get, you're completely self-sufficient. Hardcore should be pretty obvious. It means that if you die, it's basically permadeath. Your character gets removed from the hardcore league, so to speak. Some games delete your character completely, some games put them back into the softcore league. I don't know how PoE 2 works, I haven't died yet, but I think that this alters the play experience in a really interesting way. It effectively becomes what's a single-player roguelike, which is really sensible because Diablo 1 was probably heavily inspired by games like Rogue and NetHack back in the day. I think ARPG and roguelike have massive design DNA overlap, crossover, and cross-pollination between them. Tile sets and areas are randomly generated every time. The items you get every run will also be random and different. Death is permanent if you're playing on hardcore. Death is obviously permanent if you're playing a roguelike. Resets are integral to both genres and formats. The big difference is hardcore solo self-found in an ARPG is experienced on a much longer timescale, unless you're extremely unfortunate, in which case it's experienced on a very short timescale because, you die. So ARPGs can become stagnant when players feel they've solved a character to the point where no more meaningful progress can be made, right? As such, many employ resets. Players can only engage with and enjoy the new themes or unique flavors of a new season or a new league by starting a new character. Not coincidentally, this is the window of time in which an ARPG is always most exciting, dynamic, and unpredictable. You're engaging with build crafting and character growth once more. Crucially, upgrades always feel most meaningful and most diverse early game, because getting anything when you start with nothing is the most massive and easy to read contrast in any game, in ARPGs especially, from what I've experienced so far. So resets are integral to ARPG culture because they also leverage the inherent replayability of randomness. When you're starting a new character, it's less boring than it would be in other games that do not have procedural generation or do not have random elements. Not everything is going to be the same. The maps, they're not necessarily going to have the same layouts. The monsters you meet might not have the same modifiers. Certainly the items that drop for you are going to be pretty different every playthrough. So hardcore is a way for a player to impose that reset on themselves while still accessing it by some means that is formally recognized and thus enforced by the actual game state. You're not just self-imposing something, it's an actual game mode, like an official game mode. So the emotional devastation of dying is accompanied by the dim acknowledgement that this is kind of what was hoped for the whole time, a reason to reset, to experience that most exciting and dynamic window of playtime in the ARPG yet again. Well, my hardcore character hasn't died in Path of Exile 2 just yet. I have played hardcore once or twice in other games, not necessarily ARPGs, but other games with random elements, and that was the fun part of that as well. And like I said, I've also played a lot of roguelikes, where dying and having to scrounge up everything from the start all over again is a big part of the experience. Resets being so central to ARPG design and player culture causes a potential problem to arise though, where some players see replayability because it's practically enforced, others may be burdened with unpleasant repetition. They don't appreciate their effort being lost when having to start new characters every few months, or, if they're playing hardcore every time they die. So that's probably why a player like that wouldn't really be playing hardcore. This is a contrast to games like Destiny, Anthem, or Warframe, to name a few examples, wherein progression is part of a specific character's life journey almost, like their life story. Knowledge is still integral to those games the more invested and deeper in you get, but the joy of those is experiencing new situations and doing increasingly bolder personal challenges while embodying a consistent character who only ever gains and can never truly lose or regress in any meaningful way. Like my Tenno in Warframe is is the same character I've been playing since I started the game. My Guardian, Cassius in Destiny 2, my Hunter, like, he's the same Hunter I've been playing since I started the game. Now, resetting can feel bad, but invested ARPG fanatics typically resolve this mentally and emotionally through an interesting framing, and it's the framing that there is a type of progression that no reset can ever take away from you, and that progression is knowledge. A player who knows the passive tree and has an idea of items, what bosses have which attacks, which areas are annoying, which areas can be breezed through, that player will play the campaign way faster. With every reset, every hardcore permadeath, every new character a player builds, they naturally and accidentally become exposed to increasingly more and more knowledge they instinctively carry with themselves into the next league, season, or hardcore reset. This is doubly true if, you have friends who play the game or you're involved with the community in some way. People tend to share tips with each other, they tend to share build ideas, and in a game like Path of Exile and Path of Exile 2, this becomes much more significant because the games have so many different things to keep track of and keep in mind that it's highly unlikely you as a solo player will understand everything immediately. On my first playthrough, I have taken advice from my good friends Arcanix and Taconic. I have likewise iterated on their advice to check out new things, and later when I've struggled, when I've reached maps, like on my softcore character for example, I've went to them for advice again. Basically, because the game has so much complexity and so much depth, it's very enjoyable to share information in a way that kind of does remind me of games like Dark Souls, for example, which are also very heavily knowledge-based, which we will talk about a little bit later. Resets are also a type of kindness to new or less experienced players, since they are fundamentally an equalizer. The number one player on the ladder, they're literally perfected Deadeye or literally perfected Pillar of the Caged Gods mercenary. That character doesn't matter whatsoever anymore when everyone is playing a new league and those godlike finished characters have to be left behind and are unplayable. Yet, they still have a good chance to be the first player to reach that high again due to their accrued knowledge, which the new players of course will not have. So resets are generally seen as a favorable interaction in ARPGs. They are the breath of the game, inhaling and exhaling in waves. Because finished builds are stagnant builds. So the next reset is another opportunity to enjoy all the knowledge you gained from your previous reset, which is something that rarely happens that profoundly inside of the same reset you learned that knowledge in. You don't really feel it so intensely, but the next time you play the game, when you're starting from zero, you know all these little shortcuts in your head, and they're helping you out, they're helping you play faster. Hardcore solo self-found supercharges the meaning of everything I just mentioned. When you can't guarantee you'll get everything you need to progress safely in challenging environments, your understanding of the game, which is quite deep and will only grow deeper as the still incomplete weapon types and classes get added, is what will save you and what will carry you forward. ARPG players tend to be okay with resets because they frame them mentally as something that's not so much a loss, but an opportunity to once more enjoy the fun part of the game. The upward climb, the sharpening, the step-by-step improvement. One level, one armor mod, and one lucky drop at a time, which we mentioned a little bit ago. On hardcore solo self-found, I'm more likely to try weapons and skills I may not have paid attention to on my softcore or trading character, in part because early game is so threatening, and I'm happy to hit an opponent with every advantage I know about. I don't consider myself a good player. I'm not a smart player, I'm not a knowledgeable player yet, with an encyclopedic brain storage of every mechanic, and that's exactly why I feel compelled to claw my way to every useful one I do have some awareness of. On a hardcore solo self-found, as a contrast to my normal character, I actually keep around various elemental staves, despite not being a mage, so I can exploit weaknesses enemies might have to fire ice or lightning. I may keep a bow on hand, despite not being a ranger, so I can use escape shot to get away from a swarm surrounding me because I have PTSD from enemies mobbing me, flinching me, and movement blocking me to death. And I don't want that to happen when dying is permanent. While the comparisons to Dark Souls and Elden Ring come from the designs of boss patterns, when most speakers and writers discuss PoE2, to me the spirit of Souls shines through brightest in something like hardcore solo self-found, because both it and my first experience with a new Souls-like I play both cause me to engage with what I just described, but will only now name the adventurer's mindset. I've talked about it on the channel once or twice before, but, any stray item, loose brick, shard of rock, any discarded wand or fallen soldier's shitty weapon or trinket become critical to my survival. Being a rogue is on the surface about stealing various remnants of war from battlefields, forests, and cathedrals, but only if your sight of what I do is so narrow. What I'm actually doing when I do that, when I'm taking a fallen soldier's bow or rummaging through a destroyed house for a charm that protects me from fire, is stealing survival. Is staying alive through cunning and a willingness to use anything that's still got something left in it for me to keep myself breathing a moment longer. If I have to use shields, I'll use shields. If I'm barely smart enough to cast a fireball from the staff of a bled-out mage, who pretty much deserve to live way more than I do, I'll do it. You can die in some absolutely bullshit ways in both PoE2 and Souls games, and part of being a rogue is making awareness of the bullshit be essentially your religion, so you can kick sand in its face and put a knife in its throat. You will kill me in ways that are completely unacceptable, so to stay alive, I'll abuse and murder you in ways even shittier than that. And that's a really interesting part of these games that I think people are not really considering, in part because they're not really playing hardcore or solo self-found that much, and in part because whenever a comparison already exists, people tend to gravitate to that one instead of thinking of a new one of their own. You know, the comparison between Souls and PoE2 now is like, oh, the boss fights have patterns that you have to dodge roll and iframe and, you know, hit back at the right times. Like, obviously that is very Souls-like, but I think the real Souls-like experience, if that's, you know, something you like about these games, is to try playing a hardcore character and see what that feels like. I maybe wouldn't recommend it as your first one if you don't have much experience with the genre or with this kind of play format, but if you've already played a character you really like, you've gotten through most, if not all of the campaign, you know, you played a little bit of maps, whether you like it or not, feel free to just roll a hardcore character and then use the knowledge you got from your first playthrough to try that out and just use every advantage. You know, like, try to get as far as you can, managing risk along the way in the way that suits you. It's really, really fun.